It may be hard to imagine this, but the way the latrines are set up at many of the camps, they're very precarious positions, holes cut necessarily in boards, or people having to balance on a board over a pit. And some of the survivors talk about this kind of precarious position where you're afraid of falling in. And one of the examples that kind of really struck home with me that I mentioned in the article is a woman falls in and she comes out. Now she's covered with excrement, as you can well imagine. And then her question is, how do I clean myself? I don't have access to water. And the SS guard is so disgusted by her that instead of giving her an opportunity or finding a way in which she can clean herself and continue to work, he just executes her based on it's easier to kill her than it is to provide her access to something to allow her to clean herself. And so these kinds of ways in which it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, the SS creates the conditions for seeing prisoners the way that they posit them in their mind as non-humans, as inferior beings, right?
Genocide is a new word combining the Greek word genos meaning race or group, with the root of the Latin sidere meaning to kill.
Became interested in genocide because it happened so many times.
Power is all against one. Violence is the opposite. The extreme is one against all.
This is Not to Forgive, but to Understand, a podcast series discussing genocide studies with experts and those connected to its critical questions. I am Luis Gonzalez Aponte, co-host with Saba Karim.
And what we're about is really to try to understand why evil happens, why there are perpetrations in genocidal scenarios and scenarios of mass atrocity. Not to forgive, but to understand.
Forgive, but to understand.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Edward Westermann is the Theodore Tsev and Alice R. Weiss HEF Chair in Holocaust Studies and visiting professor in the Department of History at Northwestern University. He is the author of Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany, which received the 2023 Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research. We previously spoke with Professor Westermann about that book, and in this conversation we turned to his research on thirst, water deprivation, and embodied suffering in the Holocaust.
Professor Westermann, it's a pleasure to have you on our platform today. The reason we thought of inviting you is precisely because of the session that took place at Northern Arizona University a few weeks ago, which I attended, and where I saw you present on this very unique paper on thirst. So very often we speak about famine, starvation, food insecurity when it comes to genocide. You took a very unique angle by focusing solely on thirst and on the deprivation of water, on water contamination, on water sanitation during the Holocaust. So with this in mind, could you tell us what made you embark on this research in the first place?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Saba and Luis. I appreciate the invitation to return. One of the things I've been interested in when I was looking at alcohol in the Holocaust. During the course of some of my research, I came across a water deprivation, and I've been thinking about that for quite a while. So many survivors' memoirs discuss thirst that they had. And we often see about starvation and hunger in the camps, as you mentioned. But I never really thought about, well, how is dehydration related to that? And one of the areas that was of interest to me, as we know, most people can only survive 3 to 5 days without water. Starvation can take as long as 2 months for individuals to experience that. And so when I was thinking about the way in which survivors were talking about their journey in the trains, for example, this thirst that they were having, I was immediately thinking about physiological effects. But then I started looking at the medical literature and the clinical literature, and it was very clear that there were a number of psychological effects that are associated with dehydration, and especially severe dehydration. And that started me down kind of this journey to really examining not only the physiological effects of the lack of water and what it means for individuals and what it meant, but how mental and cognitive effects were associated with thirst and dehydration, and how some of these physiological effects could also help us to describe the way in which prisoners were impacted, but maybe also the way in which we should understand issues of mortality and morbidity, so death and disease within the camps.
So, in your presentation, the one that you held at NAU at Northern Arizona University, you titled it "Thirst is Dreadful, Worse Than Hunger." And in your opinion, why is thirst in the context of the camps experienced as more acute or more devastating than hunger?
Well, to me, that was a direct quote taken from a survivor. And in the actual presentation, I have several. What really struck me doing this research is there are several survivors who described thirst as the worst thing that they experienced in the camp. And that really stuck out to me. So Charlotte Delbo, for example, describes the madness of thirst. And Olga Lignell, a survivor who writes Five Chimneys, a memoir that appears very shortly, 1946, very shortly after World War II. And she describes that all of her memories are intertwined with thirst. And so as I kind of continued to look at that, it was very clear to me that many survivors, thirst was just this something that was absolutely dominated the way they experienced the camp. And then if we think about what water sources were or were not available in the camps, it became very clear that not only was thirst a physical kind of this physiological kind of manifestation that they were experiencing, but that water in general as kind of a good that could be used, that was available or not available to those within the camps, became a way to really think about a number of effects. So what many people may or may not realize is that in the case of hunger, you actually need a certain amount of water to efficiently metabolize food. And absent that water, food is inefficiently metabolized. So what started to become very clear to me is that starvation and dehydration are interlinked and interwoven in a very profound way within the camps. What also was clear is that disease and waterborne disease is something that one finds. So typhoid, cholera less, scabies. You find the ways in which dysentery is a bacterial, normally bacterial in this case, and can be waterborne. And you find how these diseases themselves that were tied to water and bad water sources increase death rates and increase sickness within the camp. So that was another kind of linkage. And as you brought up, for me, as I kind of considered this, and I would talk to my students, is this idea of personal hygiene and this idea of how the lack of personal hygiene or the inability to clean oneself, how that's also interwoven into many survivors' memories of the camps. And then if you look again at the medical literature on this or clinical literature on this, we see, especially in cases of where some of the literature relates to mental health and personal hygiene, that there's a kind of bidirectional there's a bidirectional kind of a bidirectional connection between these two things. In some cases, people experiencing severe mental health neglect hygiene. But what you also understand with bidirectional is that poor personal hygiene can affect one's mental health and one's psychological state. And so it was as I continued to look at this, it was very clear that there were a number of relationships between access to water that could be directly tied, especially to psychological, mental, cognitive state, not just physiological well-being.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, the deeper we go, we see these connections between water, starvation, water, sanitation, mental health. And so the plot just keeps getting complex as we go on, as we do the research. So first of all, methodologically, how do you reconstruct something as elusive as thirst? What kinds of sources, survivor testimonies, perpetrator records, medical data allow you to trace this experience historically?
Yeah, that was going to be a challenge, and I think what helped me in this case was the previous book that looked at alcohol. I really borrowed a lot from social sciences and to a certain degree from medical literature that helped to explain certain kinds of conditions that could result from overconsumption of alcohol. So, for example, loss of sleep, intestinal problems, and why I think that's important is because I think that project really sensitized me to the way in which we as historians can use medical science literature to think about things that we're looking at. We don't have, for example, with the exception of some of the forced experimentation that took place on prisoners, the seawater I mentioned, forced seawater consumption or hypothermia. We really don't have individual patient medical records in most cases of survivors. But what we're able to do, and this is where I think this is important, is we're able to look at certain things. So, for example, the connection between starvation or lack of food and thirst or dehydration. I was speaking to my daughter. She's a primary therapist, and she works with individuals with eating disorders, and we were discussing this. And that literature that talks about how people who are suffering from some of these eating disorders, how they also limit water intake, either through diuretics, either through excess physical activity, binging, purging, the way in which it affects the body. Well, when I was thinking about that, we were talking about this, one can look at those effects indirectly on a larger population that is a non-clinical population. So forced labor in the case of people who are denied water, people who experience gastrointestinal disease, who vomiting, dysentery, diarrhea, lack of food intake, lack of water availability, and forced labor on top of that, right? So one of the things that I thought is unique about this study and about what I'm doing is the way in which we can conceptualize non-clinical settings, camp survivors, using these types of studies as a reference point. Now, they're imperfect, obviously, and there's limits to what we can do with that. But I think that this is one of the ways that historians and those of us who study genocide and study mass atrocity can think about also how these kinds of clinical studies have value for us thinking about the populations that we study in these extreme conditions. And obviously, it's not the same conditions that we're looking at, but the manifestations of, for example, acute kidney disease or lack of electrolytes and what that means for cardiovascular health or heart health, right? Those are directly things that we can look at. Just for example, like looking at how those who are on restricted diets, how glycogen, the essentially sugar or energy stored in the muscles or the liver, is no longer available or is broken down, and thinking about what that would mean for those put into hard labor in the camp. They would experience that process themselves as a result of their incarceration and as a result of the conditions they were experiencing. So that's one. I think that's one example as to the way we can look at medical effects, even absent individual medical histories.
That's very valuable, especially because sometimes what we struggle with is just finding that raw data about survivors, and usually it's not easily available or accessible. You identify and map water sources within camps and killing sites. What kinds of water were available to prisoners, and how were these sources structured, controlled, or restricted? I'm thinking very specifically about some of the images I remember that you included in your presentations that showed the horrible conditions in which prisoners in the camps had to face when they were interned.
Yeah, so the initial primary source, and one of the things that in structuring this project that I look at is for many of the prisoners, their arrival at the camp is as part of a train journey that they've undergone. And that train journey already starts the process of extreme dehydration because of the limited water that's available. So they arrive at the camp. And this is really insidious in a certain way. I describe it from the SS, because as people are getting off the train, as they're being lined up for selection, they're all being promised something. The SS is talking about, okay, we're going to send you to a shower and we're going to give you warm soup. And what's really insidious about that is if you can think about, I think all of us, especially those of us who lived in Texas or been in the summer heat or in an area where those climactic conditions are really warm in the summertime, being extremely thirsty and the desire to get to that water source. And so thinking about how the SS is using the promise really of water as a way in which to kind of cause the prisoners to kind of become compliant, want to be part of this process. In other words, hey, I'll be able to finally quench my thirst. And in fact, for those who actually do go to the showers, it's a major relief. So one of the things that I think is important to talk about, and I talk about in the project, is dehydration can happen very quickly, as I mentioned, 3 to 5 days, but you can rehydrate fairly quickly as well. So that process of rehydration can at least kind of happen more quickly than recovery, let's say, from extreme starvation. I think that that's an important point to mention. So the shower becomes the initial point for many, but then that can also wear off very quickly if people are in quarantine. So where are prisoners getting water from? Well, the primary source of water is in the so-called morning rations. For example, if we look at Auschwitz and many of the other camps, the substitute coffee or tea that's labeled that, it's not really that, it's brown water or black water that's seasoned with, leaves or different types of matter is in there, but it's a water source. In many cases, prisoners, especially those who arrive at first, are really reluctant to drink it because it doesn't taste good, and they kind of push it away or they dump it out. But that's a water source. The soup that prisoners are given normally at noontime is another liquid or fluid source that they get, and many of the descriptions are exactly that: is The soup is mostly water. It's not like what we would consider soup. It's water with some vegetables in it. And so it's not this kind of thick porridge. It's not kind of a stew. But it again, it's a fluid. It's a place where fluids are available. And for many of the survivors who write about this, it's very salty or doesn't have a great taste. But again, there's electrolytes in there if we kind of think in terms of what's available to the prisoners. So it's a source of the water that they can get. The latrines and the washrooms, this is where we see again what I kind of would discuss as malice aforethought. The SS limits fresh water, potable water to the camps. And oftentimes, when we're looking at the establishment of the camps, whether they're in occupied Poland, what we consider to be places like Auschwitz or Majdanek, or we look in places like Buchenwald or Belsen, that the water sources in those camps are extremely bad for the prisoners as well. And they talk about rusty pipes, little water. So even when you go to the washroom, the idea of going to the washroom and only finding a very little bit of water, we can imagine what that means for prisoners then. Many of them talk about they look at that, but it's not to clean themselves. It's to, again, try to get a water source to drink. So it's not even an availability. This personal hygiene aspect is missing. So what does that leave us? Well, for example, Mother Nature in this case, right? So rain, unexpected periods of rain, where then now prisoners have access to water, ice, snow, and especially where we see this discussed quite a bit is on the death marches, where prisoners are describing leaving Auschwitz in January, and where they're getting their water. They were given a loaf of bread, but where they're getting their water is by eating snow, for example. So precipitation is there. Another really dangerous part of this discussion that you see in the camps is the ideas of these puddles that appear in the camps. And if we think about a place like Monowitz, which is a part of the Auschwitz complex, it's created for essentially synthetic rubber and synthetic petroleum development. So the puddles that prisoners are talking about are toxic puddles in most cases. You have industrial chemicals that have polluted those areas. We see the same thing in Birkenau, where people discuss the color, the oily sheen that's on these puddles. And what is clear too is that people are drawn to them because they are a source of fluid. And in many cases, looking at Primo Levi or looking at Olga Liniel, looking at some of these survivors, as they approach these puddles, they're saved because senior prisoners, older prisoners, tell them, don't drink it. It's going to kill you or it's going to make you very sick. And so those open puddles in many cases prove a temptation for those who are maddened by thirst, who have lost kind of their mental ability or their psychological kind of stability in thinking about water. One can think how you can be driven to look at those puddles as sources, for example, of water, and then the corresponding consequences on individuals that take place as a result of what I call these toxic sources. But that's really where what the sources of water are. You have at various times in the camps, you also have the so-called Lysol baths, where prisoners are normally during outbreaks of disease. The SS decides, okay, we need to put the prisoners through these so-called Lysol baths, and it's literally a dunk. So it's almost like a vat where the prisoners go in, they're dunked, they have to put their head in it, and then they just get out. So that's not a source of fluid because you're not drinking that, right? But it is a source of disinfection at one level. But that's really where you see, again, how hygiene comes into contact with the prisoners. But the showers that we would consider in a normal, let's say, setting where you would go, okay, it's been 3 weeks. Do we get to go back to the showers? That's not what's available to most prisoner populations, right? That kind of water availability is not there. And the other thing I think is important to mention is there is another potential source of water for those who are incarcerated. So when, for example, people have to leave the camp on work details, some of them talk about crossing streams or crossing creeks or marshes or lakes. And that comes at a risk. So there are those who describe breaking out of the ranks or the columns to try to get to use their cup or their bowl to get some water to drink. But that risk that's associated with that is that the SS often then will either beat or even shoot and kill people for doing that. The other risk that we have in the case of Auschwitz, which itself is built on a swampy area, is stagnant water, has a lot of bacteria, marsh water has a lot of bacteria. And so again, you might get the momentary relief of getting fluid, but then you pay for it with the kind of bacteriological, parasitical kind of results of drinking that water that lead to diarrhea, that lead to dysentery, that then promote that extreme dehydration. And this is where I really want to focus this point on. Once you have those conditions, you don't have the ability to replenish that water. So that's where we see when we talk about the camps and dysentery as such a deadly disease within the camps. This is one of the key parts of it. Not only can't you keep food down, but you've already on a lowered water threshold, and now you're evacuating that fluid. And so the most extreme effects of dehydration are now in play for those individuals.
So I want to pit these accounts against the duplicitous practices of the SS Nazi regime at the time, because I'm thinking specifically of a quotation or a diary entry by one of the officers, the Nazi officers, who said that he had access to seltzer water because water for the rest, was contaminated there. So I think it's important to also, in doing research, point out these contrasting positions or these contrasting access to water during that time.
Yeah, what's really interesting about that is the SS guards recognize. So there's an SS man by the name of Perry Broad, and he's on the ramp at Auschwitz, and he recognizes that thirst has driven the people that are arriving are just dislocated psychologically because of the thirst. And the question is almost, is it a byproduct, or is it an intent of the SS to bring in prisoners like that, to bring in people to the camp? And I think could there have been freshwater resources available to the prisoners in a greater volume than they were? I think yes, but it would have costed resources. And the way in which the prisoners are seen on the front end anyway is essentially disposable. And that's why, for example, when we talk about starvation and the lack of food, the poor quality of food, right, that could have been improved. Now, Johann Kremer, who is an SS doctor, that's who you're referring to, he arrives in Auschwitz, and one of the first thing as an SS doctor that he recognizes is that this is really a bad area for freshwater resources, a very boggy area that includes waterborne disease. And he, in his diary remarks, he makes this, as you mentioned, he makes this remark or writes this notice down that, well, the good news is for us SS, we have all the mineral water that we want. And he even names the brand name. But in addition to that, again, if any of those who are watching today might have seen A Zone of Interest, so the film that's based on Rudolf Höss and his family living at Auschwitz, that SS men bring their families, many of them bring their families to Auschwitz. They have homes and houses with their families, so they're doing duty in the camp, they're doing duty with the SS, and they're coming home. Well, exactly those poor water, that poor water supply that is recognized, the poor groundwater quality is recognized. And so prisoners are delivering to those SS households fresh water. And you also have young Polish girls who are kind of impressed into service as maids or housekeepers for SS families. And they write about how, for example, that the SS wives, you can't do the laundry uh, at the wells there or using the water there. They have to walk several miles away to get a freshwater resource. And what's fascinating to me in that case, again, is it's the idea that that's known, and the SS has workarounds or comes up with ideas for uh, understanding the health impacts of that might have on SS families. And so they're very aware of what those, by implication, they're very aware of what those kind of effects are going to be on the prisoner population. So this kind of, again, here we see this malice aforethought, I guess is what I would describe it as in the case of water.
In addition to what you just said, when you speak about malice aforethought, I remember the anecdote that you recounted to us about the young girl falling in, a pile of excrement. Would you like to tell us more about that?
Yeah, so it may be hard to imagine this, but the way the latrines are set up at many of the camps, they're very precarious positions, holes cut necessarily in boards, or people having to balance on a board over a pit. And some of the survivors talk about this kind of precarious position where you're afraid of falling in. And one of the examples that kind of really struck home with me that I mentioned in the article is a woman falls in. Now, in many cases, if you fell in, you didn't get out. That's part of the reason why people were worried. Literally, you didn't have the strength or nobody could help you out. And people literally drowned then in that vat filled with all that urine and fecal matter. Well, in this case, they are able to get the woman out. And she comes out. Now she's covered with excrement, as you can well imagine. And then her question is, how do I clean myself? I don't have access to water. And the SS guard is so disgusted by her that instead of giving her an opportunity or finding a way in which she can clean herself and continue to work, he just executes her. Based on it's easier to kill her than it is to provide her access to something to allow her to clean herself. And so these kinds of ways in which it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, the SS creates the conditions for seeing prisoners the way that they posit them in their mind as non-humans, as inferior beings, right? And so here again, we see kind of, if you will, a second or third order effect of the lack of water that directly impacted this woman's ability or directly impacted her staying alive in the camp or being able to continue in the camp just as a result of this, which is really a horrifying, again, story to think about. And it's also I talk a little bit in there that we have also kind of gender-based issues too, with respect to infection, for example, with respect to clean clothing, and so I think in the case where we see in the women's camp, for example, where urinary tract infections, or you can see the kind of disproportionate effect. Most women, as we know from the camps, because of the starvation, because of the hard labor, stop menstruating in the camp. So menses doesn't take place. But the idea that many women talk about is how the how this lack of hygiene, personal hygiene ability to it, also impacts personal health in terms of not only physiological manifestations, but that kind of psychological manifestation that's associated with it. So to me, this is where we look beyond, for example, in some cases, direct consumption of fluid to the many kind of cascading effects that the lack of fresh water has on prisoners. And it can, as I said, age, for example, can be affected. And one of the things that was interesting to me in doing the research is that we see also a difference between how elderly or older adults are able to deal with dehydration versus younger adults. And it's probably no surprise that when we see that mortality is much greater in older adults as a result of dehydration. So medical studies that have looked at, and I cite one in the article, that have looked at millions of patients, elderly patients, in this case over the age of 65 was the clinical study line, that they looked at 10 million patients, and what they found is that those who were accessed into the healthcare system on a primary diagnosis of dehydration, 17% were dead within 30 days after that primary diagnosis. So that dehydration, this is part of another issue. Dehydration, severe dehydration, has disproportionate impacts in hypovolemia, which is lack of movement of fluids through the organs. You have the destruction or the degradation of kidneys and heart. And so what you have is you have organs that are now functioning less efficiently, but that over time are being damaged more and more as a result of dehydration. And that's disproportionately impactful on people who are older, because the organs then are more susceptible to this kind of damage. And one of the questions that I'm really thinking about, and I don't think I'll have an answer to this in this project, is the long-term effects. So one of the things we know is certainly liberation is a time of freedom. That's a time when people are no longer within, let's say, the Nazi camp structure. But we know many people, thousands, if not tens of thousands, die immediately after liberation. In some cases, it's trying to eat too much food. The body can't handle it. In some cases, though, it's the result of the degradation of their bodies over the time that they've been in there. And so what is really interesting to me is, can we think about how the Holocaust, the direct effects of those camp systems are going to continue for months and for years and maybe for a decade or more on life expectancy of those who have been impacted by the medical or physiological effects that's related to the deprivation that they experienced in the camps. And I think that's a really open question that hasn't really been explored.
I mean, this also brings to mind the possibility that there may have been deaths and illnesses that were misattributed or insufficiently explained at the time. And I'm sure that this continues even in the case of ongoing genocides, contemporarily, just because we don't have the right kind of expertise or data to be able to track all of these evolutions or devolutions. We spoke about that girl and falling in that vat of excrement. We spoke about how she was shot thereafter when she was removed from the pit. I mean, this evokes the very basis of what we find in all genocides, which is the element of dehumanization. So I don't know if you'd like to touch on that further. We have spoken about it largely, but I think just identifying how this lack of water, and thirst, starvation, all of these factors together lead to the element of, or lead to the factor of dehumanization, which just adds to the genocidal machinery as a whole.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. So, for example, another place where we see it is in the ghettos, right? So, in the ghettos in occupied Poland, there's also a lack of freshwater resources. We know that there's lack of food there. And what we also know is that there are Germans who go on these so-called ghetto tourism buses that kind of go into the ghetto, and they're going in, and what they're looking at is they're seeing these people who are in these terrible conditions, and it's the idea behind it is now they're going like, okay, this is exactly the kind of person that propaganda has talked about. These are exactly the way we imagine these people are, and they're not thinking that, like in the camps, people who are put in these conditions essentially devolve to that state as a result of the conditions that have been created. So they're not making that kind of connection. So they immediately jump to, aha, so in this case, Hitler or Nazi propaganda is right. These are subhumans. Just look at the way, how dirty they are, how they smell, and they've created that. And I think in other genocidal contexts, right, that we see the way in which people who are put in these conditions themselves can be seen by the perpetrators as deserving of their fate, just like that SS man, because because they've created the conditions to kind of confirm that worldview that they have of the victim group. And I think that's something that we see, and it's not just in the camps, it's in the ghettos in the case of the Holocaust. But I certainly think that one could look at other situations when we think about Armenia and the treks that people are undergoing, the women and children especially, how that might impact the lack of access to water and food, how that might have impacted, especially the very young, which again would make sense here as if you think about physiologically, the very young and the very old are highly susceptible to the effects of dehydration. So here again, we might be able to think about how those effects are seen in other contexts, especially Armenia comes to mind because of kind of the forced marches that are associated with that, the displacement of peoples, as might be another way to look at it. Cambodia, perhaps a little bit as well as the marches of the new civilians, the new people out of the capital or out of the urban centers. So I think this. To your point, I think that this area of research, kind of like the use of alcohol by the perpetrators, potentially gives us another way of thinking about other situations. And one of the things that this question reminds me of, is we also see this lack of freshwater resources in the prisoner of war camps. So when we look at Soviet camps, Soviet POW camps, we think about this death of between January of 1941 and February 1942, 2 million Soviet prisoners of war will perish in Wehrmacht, so in German army prisoners of war camps. And when we look at, it's not just the lack of food, it's also, again, the conditions that I'm talking about, lack of water, atrocious hygiene, which leads to also disease spread, waterborne disease, but also typhus, lice, for example, that are associated with this lack of personal hygiene, the ability to clean oneself. So we see it there, but even we see it in U.S. and British prisoner of war camps, in other words, the ones that the Germans are in charge of, where you have U.S. prisoners of war talking about poor water and what that means for dysentery, for example. So it's a shared misery, as I talk about in all the camps, even if it's not a shared fate oftentimes. So the other Allied, not Soviet prisoner of war, that death rate is about 3%, I think, for U.S. and British prisoners of war. About 3% die. We know almost 60% of Soviet prisoners of war die in German captivity, right? So, but
Yeah.
some of the conditions are in many respects are in many respects the same. Red Cross ability to get into some of these other camps is important. So there's quite a bit to untie. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, as you kind of pull on that thread, you kind of see that there's a lot of other things related to it as well.
So what is interesting in all of this is I'm thinking about how thirst, deprivation of water, provision of water which is contaminated is actually a form of control over the population. And I think it's important to point this out in any paper that we're writing on the subject, because I'm thinking about how we have a very restrictive definition of genocide out there, which is usually pegged to actual killings. Whereas if we look deeper, and all of us in the field of genocide studies agree that you can exterminate a population through slow violence. So even if you don't kill all of them, the way you torture them, the way you subject them to control mechanisms is cruel enough to warrant the calling of it as a genocide. And yet, in all of the genocides that I have studied, there is a problem of famine, food insecurity, deprivation of water, including the recent research I did on Cambodia, which I will come back to later. So what are your thoughts? Because obviously you dealt with perpetrators in the Holocaust. How do you connect this issue of control to all that we talked about with water?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and it gets to it gets to the idea of if we look at what, for example, the SS believes about prisoner longevity in the camps. So the studies or the estimations that people like Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, makes, and some of the guards, is they talk about that the average prisoner doing hard labor is expected to survive about 90 days. So 3 months is the life expectancy of the average prisoner. Who is actually then admitted into the camp, right? Versus those that are taken directly to the gas chamber or killed even before they're allowed to go into the camp. So I think what we're seeing is this idea of the way in which prisoners are a disposable good. So the Israeli historian Lenny Yahil had talked about this annihilation through labor as kind of you squeeze out this labor from these prisoner populations, which you see to be a population that you can continue to turn over. In other words, there'll always be the idea, there'll always be another deportation train arriving. Now, at the end, near the end of the war, 1943, Himmler recognizes how much this labor is important and tries to institute, not because he has some kind of change of mind about the process of annihilation, but the idea that the SS needs to kind of create better conditions, less beatings. So there's supposed to be prohibitions on punishments against prisoners, physical abuse that's levied on them, as a way to kind of extend the life cycle, if you will, for prisoners. So it's this very utilitarian way that's looked at, and I'm still struggling. I know that I'm kind of dancing around your question a little bit because I do think that that the element of control is certainly there, but I think it's almost like if it had been more long term, right? If it had been more uh, kind of symptomatic or measured the way in which they did this, I would think that yeah, that's another way of looking at it. And maybe in some of the labor camps that's the case, um, but in kind of the killing centers and obviously in places like Auschwitz and Majdanek, I think it's just that this view of this of what's essentially a labor force that's going to be used up anyway, so it doesn't matter, right? So that 90-day clock starts ticking, and so there's no worries about it because you can see immediately how this kind of deterioration starts to take place amongst the majority of the prisoners, especially those who are not in so-called prominent positions, but those who are in direct labor details.
Professor Westermann, staying on the subject of control, and I have two questions. Just one quick follow up on this note while we're here. I couldn't help but recall a quote and a section from your book, Drunk on Genocide, whenever we're talking about perpetrator behavior in this case, especially. And you write about a SS game, or a game played by SS officers, where you write in quote, "In another version of this game, the SS forced a prisoner to hold a glass of water, saying, if the glass was hit, the person was allowed to live." And whenever we're talking about control and perpetrator behavior, was there an element of humiliation involved here?
Yeah, that's a great question, Luis, because this is again where we get into as someone who's really thought about perpetrator behavior and mindset for a long time. One of the things that really struck me in looking at this is the way the perpetrators integrated thirst in some of the games that they played with the prisoners. So, in Auschwitz, the main camp, for example, one of the SS men in the political department is a guy by the name of Friedrich Wilhelm Boger. And he's infamous, notorious. He's the guy that created the so-called Boger swing, which was a way to beat prisoners and have them kind of splayed out where you could really inflict maximum damage in beatings. Well, he also has an interrogation technique where he has prisoners sit down. And again, we are thinking about prisoners who are dehydrated and starving. Well, he hands them a large portion of sardines or anchovies, salted fish essentially, and forces them to eat it until they kind of vomit. And then he has a bucket of water, which he continues to move around the prisoner. And that to me is this kind of if you're thinking how water's being used as a prop, someone now who is already dehydrated now is just all they want is some water because their mouth is just filled with salt essentially, right? And their body's demanding it and using that as a way to kind of torture prisoners during an interrogation. Uh, another example that is really that gets to this is the SS man who has a prisoner come in and asks him, "Hey, when's the last time you've had any wine to drink?" And the prisoner, of course, says, "Oh, I haven't had any wine to drink since I've been here." And the guy says, "Oh, well, here's some golden wine for you to drink," and tells him to drink it. And the prisoner immediately looks at it and starts drinking and realizes it's urine, but is forced to drink it down, right? So humiliation that's used in forcing prisoners to drink their own urine. And what's even more kind of diabolical in this case is we know in the case of some of the train transports that people that are driven crazy by thirst even are forced or drink their own urine as a way to try to quench their thirst, but they're not super dehydrated at that point. So what happens physiologically is more and more salt. The more dehydrated you are, the more salts or electrolytes that are in that urine. So what ends up happening is you get in a vicious cycle. You're not getting any kind of water. Your body is now trying to liver. Kidneys now are at extreme risk as they are trying to now filter out a highly kind of sodium enriched kind of solution that happens there. So to answer your question, where it was the SS men who are showing off their marksmanship by shooting the glass out of the hand of the prisoner, that they incorporate this idea of humiliation and thirst and water in their own games and in their own abuse of prisoners, which gets back, I guess this gets back to the question of control that was mentioned earlier. So they're using games because they know they're controlling the water and they are controlling the activity of those who are suffering from that through the use of the water in a very intentional way. So I guess that this kind of does connect us back to that use of control in an intentional way through the use of water or fluid to kind of abuse prisoners.
Right. And zooming out a little bit, what does your work suggest about the limits of how we've historically understood suffering in the Holocaust? Has thirst been marginalized because it is harder to quantify, or because it sits at this intersection of environment, biology, and violence?
Yeah, that to me is really the $1 million question, and I've thought about that too because thirst is mentioned in Nicholas Waksman's great book KL. So his this really magisterial look at the concentration camps. He mentions this interaction of starvation. He talks about thirst in there, so hunger and thirst. I think what has happened in the literature is that hunger is the thing that people, if they focused on anything, actually, hunger is what tends to be focused on. And people have just looked by thirst as kind of a byproduct of camp life. And this is where I think one of the key interventions of this study is because what we know is kind of the subtitle of what I'm looking at is this idea of dehydration and despair and delirium and death. And what I mean by that is when we look at severe dehydration and its manifestations, the psychological effects of that, we talk in the camps about the so-called Musulmana, these guys who have given up, men and women who have given up hope of survival. They're completely apathetic. In some cases, they're raving. In some cases, they're just absolutely have lost their ability to interact cognitively or mentally or with other individuals. And to me, one of the things that I was thinking about as I was doing this is this very real connection between dehydration and those psychological and mental effects and the type of condition that we talk about with these individuals who have given up the hope of living and become completely apathetic. Now that can be tied to food too, but it's kind of that interweaving of dehydration with starvation, and we see this in the case of where individuals are offered food, and in some cases in the ghettos where children come into the ghetto hospitals, they no longer can eat. It's progressed to the point where even if they're given food, it's too late, right? And I think that that's the damage that's been done internally as a result of some of this dehydration that's there. And I think that that also may be one of the ways in which we can understand this kind of psychological dislocation that led to individuals giving up. Just that was enough. And I talk about in the article, I talk about a prisoner, Charlotte Delbo, who's a French communist, who it's a really powerful story that she writes in her memoir. Her friends think she's slipping into madness. She talks about she's no longer able to eat. Her lips are dry. Her tongue's wooden, she talks about. She stumbles around. She's lost muscular coordination, which gets tied to this cramping. And her friends say she's not going to make it. So they come up with a plan. And their plan is to get on a work detail that goes to the SS tree nursery that next day. And they tell her, hang on, we're going to take care of you. We're going to get you water. Um, and she's delirious now. She's really exhibiting the worst aspects of dehydration. And the next day, they get her to that tree nursery. And what they are able to do is get a pail of water that is supposed to be poured for the trees. And Charlotte Delbo describes seeing that water and sticking her head, she says, like a horse into the water, her nose, her head, and she drinks and gulps with her nose underwater. And her friends who are there see how much she's drinking, and they like try to pull her out and say, okay, you've had enough. There's, you're okay now. And she refuses. She goes back in and she talks about drinking every last drop of water in that pail. And then she talks about the relief that started to kind of work back through her, the cognitive ability to now understand what's around her, her physical condition being better. And she also talks about how her stomach's completely distended from drinking a pail of water. And if you think about that, right, this might have been an individual who in her memoir she has numerous chapters, numerous poems, numerous stories, but there's only one chapter heading that's repeated twice in the entire book, and it's thirst is the chapter heading. And so what we see is she might have been at the point, she might have been one of those people at the point where another day would have been a day too many for her, right? And so I think that that these kinds of stories are not always, we can't, like I said, we can't medically examine the individual, but I think from the stories themselves, we can make inferences about their condition. And also what's really interesting is seeing how rehydration, how even a little bit of water, the impact that I talk about in the article on individuals who are then able to kind of come back to themselves. They've been dizzy, they've been losing consciousness, or even a little bit of water now, the body is able to at least start to function again, and cognitive function returns to individuals. So I think that those are really important kind of ways to look at this. So to get to your question, I just think that thirst has been one of those things that has been hiding in plain sight again, and I think that most people that have even looked at it, hunger is I would say under researched as well, really, even though it's known about starvation, the effects of starvation are widely known about, but I think it's under researched. And if hunger is under researched, I think this is where dehydration and thirst, it's just kind of, that's a topic that has been there all along for us to see, but we really didn't think about it in the ways in which to posit what it meant for prisoners' survival and the various effects of the lack of water, I think is an even more profound issue that comes out of this study.
Just because you mentioned Charlotte Delbo, I remember reading her when I was a teenager, and I remember reading her poetry and being very marked by the concept of useless knowledge when she was commenting on how people were romanticizing the pain that she had gone through. And she said, pain is useless knowledge. It doesn't add any benefit to your life. It doesn't make you grow or anything. It was just pointless, the suffering that we went through. I want to now just move on to the final questions we have for you. Do you see connections between your findings and other genocidal contexts where control over water or environmental conditions became became a tool of violence. I'm asking this question specifically because in my recent research on Cambodia, when I had your research in mind because I was preparing for this interview, I realized when I myself embarked on this search for terms related to water and thirst and sanitation through these memoirs of survivors of the Cambodian genocide, I realized that in contrast to your paper and your research findings, I noticed that in Cambodia specifically, because the people worked in these camps, right, in nature, they did have access to water. Not all the time, of course, they had the usual problems with sanitation, but there was more abundance in terms of mentions, references to water sources. For instance, survivors spoke about having the benefit of just taking a plunge in a river or in a lake somewhere and refreshing themselves. So I was just thinking about how although famine, food insecurity is homogeneous across all genocides, so is water, deprivation, thirst, contamination, and all. But in some instances, the conditions are slightly better.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I don't know enough about, for example, about Sudan, right? But I'm thinking about how climatic conditions in various areas, the type of topography. So where when I did look at the experience of Native American tribes, for example, if we look at the desert Southwest and we think about Apache or Dene Navajo people and the way in which water becomes very important. So controlling water sources, and this is where control comes in. I think this is a really great example. If you control the water sources, then you actually control a lot about what people in those regions can or can't do, right? If they have to come to you for the water sources, or you can deny them water sources. And in another way, what was quite interesting is how the Apache would understand that these U.S. Cavalry garrisons, these U.S. Mounted garrisons, they had these fodder-fed horses, and they had a strategy of forcing the U.S. Army to use these horses to come out, to go into chases. And what ends up happening is the U.S. Army recognizes in this period in the 1800s is that they're losing a lot of horses because of lack of fresh fodder, but also lack of water, and it breaks them down, right? And the Apache recognize that this is a tactic that they can use to essentially eliminate the mobility of these forces. But controlling water sources, for example, I think we could really look at different areas. So we could look at areas of where water sources, maybe in Northeast Africa, and conflicts are controlled by different groups, and how we know starvation in those areas has taken place during some of these conflicts. That to me, I think this opens up another way of thinking about how, in specific circumstances, water denial and lack of fresh water or control of water sources can be a way of, as you mentioned earlier, either trying to influence control over individuals, or even worse, trying to exacerbate conditions that leads to mass suffering and mass mortality or mass disease in those conditions. So I think that hopefully maybe this conversation will be one in which individuals can say, okay, actually in my context, I can actually see how this topic would influence the way I think about what occurred in this mass atrocity event, or in this genocide, or issue of ethnic cleansing and driving people away, for example, from water sources. So I think hopefully it's like the alcohol book. It will generate research in other contexts that provide more insights into those areas as well.
There is no doubt that this is very unique research. I have attended one workshop so far which was based on famine and starvation, food insecurity. And then I have also attended a lecture series that was based on the same topic, but you are the only person who brought up the issue of water, which is very crucial, as we can see very clearly through this interview, that it is connected to absolutely everything, medicine and starvation and everything that goes with that. So I have a final question. What has been most difficult or most ethically challenging for you in researching and writing about thirst? And what do you hope scholars and readers take away from this work?
So I think the greatest difficulty is kind of a somewhat of a practical difficulty that I talked about before, is trying to disentangle or understand how dehydration and starvation work together and how we can think about that. And then what becomes more difficult is taking medical literature or medical studies, and especially when we deal with these psychological impacts of some of these of this kind of deprivation, and then looking backwards and to see what are the manifestations, what are some of the symptoms that individuals are talking about, and can we as historians or we as scholars, can we go back and kind of say, okay, well, that looks to me like that's symptomatic based on the literature that I've seen. That's a difficult. I think that's a difficult thing to do. I think it's important to recognize what the limitations of that are. But I also think that what it shows is that we kind of become siloed a lot when we're scholars in the things that we think about. And what would be really interesting in this case is, again, medical doctors or medical researchers going like, I haven't really thought about, I look at my clinical population in LA, or I look at a clinical population in Chicago, and I recognize that this dehydration is an issue, but I've never thought about it in terms of other populations that may have experienced it. So to me, I think that's a challenge, but that's also, that really also kind of creates the reward, if you will, or the so what. Why is this important? It's the insights. It's the new insights that we potentially gain by thinking about things that we haven't thought about in these terms before. So to me, that's really the key challenge. And in thinking about why this matters or why it should matter, to me, and what it doesn't matter whether it's a Holocaust or any other case of mass atrocity or genocide. I think all of us as scholars, one of the things that we want to do is we want to connect with the human element of what's happening to individuals in these situations, and humanizing them and humanizing their experience so that it becomes, as you say in this podcast, understanding what they went through, to understand what happened to them in a way that kind of can inform how we think about these events and how we can think about what their suffering was like, and why it should be important to us. So to me, this is a topic that really does humanize the experience and the suffering of the victims, where a lot of times I've focused on the mentality and the mindset of the perpetrators. I think this one really brings me back centered on the experience of those in the camps. And to me, that's an important, maybe the older you get, it becomes more important to you too, the more philosophically you focus on some of those events. It's less academic and it's more personal, I guess, in that case.
Professor Westermann, before we close today, we like to go ahead and ask our guests now if you have 2 book recommendations for our community to go and visit and read. Absolutely, we'll go ahead and share, of course, your book, Drunk on Genocide. But are there 2 book recommendations for our listeners that you would like to provide?
Yeah, I definitely think if we're going to talk about looking at the camps, I mentioned earlier Nicholas Waxman's book KL, on the concentration camps, is really a fantastic study. Uh, and if I could, I would really like to say focus on a couple of survivor memoirs. So we talked about Charlotte Delbo, Auschwitz and After is really a fascinating book with many insights on her own experience. Olga Lignell, Five Chimneys, as well. And I'm going to give one because I want to, again, Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz and Elie Wiesel. These are topics that are there in those memoirs, even if we haven't really talked about thirst and dehydration. So the memoir literature that exists, I think, is really quite substantial in that way.
This was Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with our guest, Edward Westermann. To our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions.